Hey, you believers, non-believers, unaffiliated believers, sort of believers, and even you think I'm a believers. Welcome to the Uncensored Unprofessor. This is a podcast where we welcome converts, but where we think like disciples. It's a show where we do our best to apply theologic to all of life. First, per usual, some theocultural reflections. Oh, and why? Why do I give theological reflections on culture? Because despite the strategy adopted by evangelicals for, the last 110 years, culture matters. Despite the cautious nature of evangelicals in and through and after the summer-long George Floyd riots and the madness of the COVIDia-driven societal shutdown, culture matters. And for your information, this vignette stems from a conversation I had with my old friend Stinger. So, do you have an idea for me? Do you have a question or a possible topic for a show or a series? Email me at uncensoredunprofessor@gmail.com. I'd love to hear from you. Again, evangelicals think that the sole reason Christ came was to get people saved, or the sole reason the Bible was given was just to get people saved. But honestly, if you read the Bible carefully, not only reading it devotionally, but historically and philosophically and theologically, you'll see that, from Genesis 1, God cares about culture. Christ, Ephesians and Colossians and all four Gospels and the Revelation all make clear Christ came to reconcile and redeem all of reality, not least of which is human culture. Culture matters. And sorry to be the theologian, to think carefully, we need to make a necessary qualifier. Why does culture matter? Or better, why should culture matter to Christians? Because culture shapes souls. If evangelicals' deepest concern is that souls know God, then culture is quite important. Culture shapes souls. Culture makes souls more open or more close to the gospel. Culture either harmonizes with or stands defiantly against Christ and his gospel. Gersh, I can depart from the theoretical and ask you, my listeners, simply to reflect on your kids or grandkids or relatives. Have they been shaped more by their experience in church or by the broader culture? That's a personal question, Ed. Why do you always have to speak with such violence? And besides, the gospel doesn't have anything to do with politics. Well, sorry, sir. The gospel is something given by God that has to do with everything. But let me go back to my uncomfortable question. Have your kids and grandkids and relatives been shaped more by their experience in church or by their family upraising or by the broader culture? You see, culture is powerful. And Jesus? He said he was going to judge all the nations. One great place you can see that is in Matthew 25. And what, we fairly wonder, regarding what criterion is Jesus going to judge the nations? Well, in Matthew 25, it pertains to the shape of their culture. Was their culture godly righteous? Or was their culture indifferent? Did their cultures prop up false gods, power, comfort, safety? If so, Jesus says there's hellfire awaiting. Matthew 25, verse 41. No, what God wants is not only that individual souls get converted by the gospel, but that cultures get converted. God loves all of reality, cultures too. Culture matters. And praise God, the Christ-confessing church is finally starting to proclaim that. How do I know? Because progressives are starting to publicly complain, accusing pastors of radicalizing the churches, accusing us of nationalizing our churches, whatever that even means. By the way, I did an episode on nationalism, number 115, The Common Good. Let's talk about nationalism. But the progressives hate that the church would speak into matters that shape the collective public consciousness. Things like economics, human sexuality, civil rights, American history, constitutional liberties. All of those shape the public consciousness, which means all of those shape individual souls. So, among other things, when we listen to postmoderns criticize pastors who speak up publicly, when the pastors have the courage to speak into matters of culture and the postmoderns are upset about that, we know that we are being taken seriously as a threat to Lord Zeitgeist's power. And praise you, Lord. The church has finally started daring to speak out on matters that affect the common good, and it's not only stars like Eric Metaxas, it's local, small-town pastors too. No, true, alas, sadly, denominational leaders still haven't begun to speak forth with any notable courage, but at least small-town pastors are. They have finally begun to realize that they're losing their parishioners and their members' worldviews, and so their hearts and affections, and losing all that to the dominant postmodern culture. And hey, all you pastors who have, in one way or another, found the courage to begin speaking towards societal issues and culture from the pulpit, would you please stand still while I give you a big evangelical side hug?
Aww.
Culture matters. So, just what is culture? For aesthetes, culture gets narrowed to things like art, music, clothing styles, food, and language. Particularly, some think of culture as something stemming from the highbrow echelons of society, like what you'd find at a museum or a live theater.
Oh, Ed, you're so right. I just loves me some all-nude performance art. Or if you know some artist who can take some street trash and turn it into assemblage, why, I'd be just over the moon. That's M.O. good stuff.
But we all know culture is many much more than those items. Let me take a definition of culture from one of my favorite Christian thinkers, missiologist Leslie Newbigin. He said, quote, "The sum total of ways of living developed by a group of human beings and handed on from generation to generation," end quote. That's culture, the sum total. And wow, that sounds like we're talking about everything. Well, in some ways we are, yes. Everything pertaining to being human, or the shared life of being human anyway, but culture would certainly and more specifically include things like religion, traditions, educational systems, values, beliefs, lifestyles, shared attitudes. Because that which gets handed on from one generation to the next is often attitudinal, right? Affections, the things we like and dislike and why, are attitudinal. Sometimes our moral frameworks are more attitudinal than they are reasoned. Whole value systems can be based in attitudes. Those are all dynamics that get shaped by collectively embraced attitudes. And so, the gospel of Jesus calls us, Newbigin says, quote, "The gospel of Christ calls into question all cultures, including the Jewish one in which it was originally embodied," end quote. The gospel of Jesus calls into question everything. Nothing is off limits. Culture is not a sacred cow. Oh man, oh man. I had students over 14 years. I had students who almost had aneurysms when I would suggest that the claims of Jesus Christ judge culture too. Or they'd freak out when I'd say the claims of Jesus Christ even judged foreign and indigenous cultures. They'd been taught in different humanities courses that culture, again, especially indigenous cultures, because indigenous is frequently a way to express self-loathing for one's own culture. They'd been taught that culture was itself sacred, beyond critique. But if Jesus is Lord, he is Lord over cultures too, and that includes American culture. It will all answer to him. Or to put it still another biblical way, Christ means to redeem it all. Hey, thanks for joining me on the greatest adventure in all of reality, serving Jesus Christ in a dangerous world. It's dangerous to be a pro-life judge. It's dangerous to assert that all cultures are not equal. Dangerous to believe that the nuclear family should be celebrated. Dangerous to believe tough love is good for human souls. And dangerous to assert that the Bible is God's book for all of humanity. Thanks for joining me on this adventure of a lifetime. Here's the deal. Everything our politicians do is fair game for scrutiny. They serve us. We don't serve them. But what that means for this show? Eventually, by scrutinizing sweeping political and cultural matters, I'll offend everyone. Open borders? You're a racist, Dr. Ed. Capital T truth? You're a hater, Ed. World religions?
Why are you such an exclusivist pig, Mr. UU?
Rioting passed off as peace? Ed, you really need to learn to leave well enough alone. And now, how dare I? Climate change? You're not a scientist, Ed. 100% of scientists believe in global warming. So that means I do lose patrons. But you can remedy the situation. Partner with the UU at Patreon, Patreon. You can go there, make a $5 per month pledge, or 7 or 17 or 27. It processes every month without needing further attention on your part. You can be the plus to the last kind person's minus. Anyway, thanks truly for your consideration. Patreon, Patreon. I'm not making this up. This just happened. The New York Times, in their daily email feed, just riffed on my last week's episode theme. They started their important warning with, "It's getting really hot this summer." And they said, "Great Britain may have a high summer temperature of 105 degrees. Tulsa, Oklahoma has already had more days in the hundreds than ever." And the New York Times continued, "What are the feds doing about it? Nothing. The lack of U.S. action on climate change has alarmed many experts," he wrote. "What are we going to do now?" Well, that's right, Mr. Big Apple journalist. One hot summer is proof enough to adjust all of our economic policies. Yep, one hot summer is enough to crush the poor by taking away their ability to heat their homes this winter. And oh man, like I said in last week's episode, that one hot summer is not the same as that the planet is overheating. It's like watching a cartoon come to real life. Or better, it's like having predicted propaganda and then 4 days later watching your prediction come true. Oh my goodness. Again, it's a constant and emphatic media barrage, right? 2 days after the New York Times' "Tulsa is hot, so we need to stop driving our cars." After that, 2 days after that news story, there was another article, same author, David Leonhardt, about Western Europe and global warming. Here's the gist of what he wrote. Western Europe has done more than any other continent to reduce carbon dioxide levels. They've cut CO2 by 30% since 1990. But sadly, they haven't made a difference. They are still being assaulted by climate change. And proof of global warming? It's really hot in Western Europe this summer, he wrote, and still more, one for one, air quotes, proof of global warming, says the New York Times. In Paris, the temperature also exceeded 104 degrees yesterday, a high the city has reached on only 2 other days since the late 1800s. In southwestern France, firefighters battle wildfires for the 8th straight day, end quote. And I read that and I thought, oh, you guys, you can't make this stuff up. The New York Times is basing their pleas for you to stop driving a car, or using your barbecue to cook some hot dogs, or for you to never again eat beef and thereby cut into the cow gas that's emitted into the atmosphere, basing all that on a hot summer in Europe. On a forest fire in France. Who even knows what the cause was? Because for the Times it doesn't even matter what the cause was. And all of this is not science. It is politics, but it's not science. And a quick aside on all this, New York Times author Leonhardt mentions Russia's war with Ukraine as a cause for increasing energy costs here in the United States and in Europe. And yes, he's right on that one. Wars do tend to have a quaint way of affecting prices and trade and relationships between nations. But what's interesting to me to watch is Western Europe. They are scrambling to buy more oil now that their motherlode vain Russia has them over a barrel, no pun intended. And for your information, back in May, the 27 countries in the EU voted to ban the vast majority of imports of Russian oil by the end of the year. So, do they put up with Russia invading a near neighbor and they keep buying Putin's oil, or do they cut the umbilical cord and actualize they're not going to have enough winter fuel this coming winter? It's all complicated stuff. And it all makes me wonder, makes me hope even. Will Western Europeans realize that the green energy movement will not at all sate the human population's energy needs? We'll see. But I'm going to bet that one icy cold European winter will help them sort all that out. And by the way, I thought this one was interesting. Environmental scientist Bjorn Lomborg says 10 times more people die from winter cold than they do from summer heat. And then now we see that Joe Biden will soon has issued an executive order saying that since we're in now a emergency, he's going to send 2.1 billions of dollars to companies that make windmills and solar panels. And hopefully his executive order will not begin cutting power to your and my heaters this winter. Because it's sure not going to cut into Joe Biden's ability to heat his homes this winter. Look, this is as naked a grift as could be imagined. That $2.1 billion is going to go to his friends, his donors, family members, their family members, grift. Power grab, yes, but grift. Same as it ever was. Same as it ever was. Same as it ever was. Same as it grifting was. And yet, there's another way to understand this $2.1 billion effort to combat abrupt climate change. Why? Why did it take 19 months? If this is about saving the planet, why not on day one, like shutting down the Keystone Pipeline and shutting down offshore drilling and canceling other energy rules put in place by the Trump administration? Why not do it then? And here's one theory I came up with. It's not really that important to Biden. He may merely be placating the progressives. I mean, sheesh, shouldn't it be 20 billion? Why only 2.1 billion? Golly gee, Grandpa. If it's about stopping an existential threat to humanity, why not 200 billion? I know, 2.1 billion seems a paltry amount. And so, my listener, I don't know. I'll let you decide what this means. I do know that policies like what California presently has in place to end all fossil fuel emissions by 2035, which means ending all gasoline-powered automobiles and leaf blowers and lawnmowers and shipping trucks and scooters, those things will cause economic disaster. But goodness, I'll get to economic disaster later in today's show. Let me change gears. Movies. This one came out in 2008. M. Night Shyamalan's movie, The Happening. I remember because I went to the theater to see it. I was excited because I loved his movies, The Sixth Sense and Signs and The Village. Shyamalan could spin a good tale. So, The Happening, starring Mark Wahlberg and Zooey Deschanel, began as your typical Shyamalan intrigue story. Honey bees begin to mysteriously disappear. And then, in Central Park, everyone's behavior changes dramatically. They become confused, start repeating their words, begin babbling, start walking backwards, even killing themselves. And then we're taken to a construction site where men begin falling, make that intentionally plunging off of the beams that were several stories up. In the movie, at first, the scientists think it was all a terrorist attack. Maybe some mind-altering gas was released, a neurotoxin. Maybe that was released into the atmosphere. And then the story follows a married couple, played by Wahlberg and Deschanel, as they try to escape and understand the bizarro events occurring in society. And if you're listening to me today but don't want to know, I'm going to tell you the ending. So, spoiler alert. The Earth is attacking human beings. Along the way, the story shows us a nursery worker man. He theorizes, correctly as it turns out, that the Earth is attacking human beings through an airborne toxin emitted by plants. The Earth is merely trying to protect itself from these foul alien beings, people, humus beings. Guys, I remember watching The Happening, and when the conclusion finally rolled around, my eyes began rolling around. I had just watched a progressive sermon. And if you know me, or if you attended one of the 74 college movie night parties Tanya and I hosted in our home across some 17 years, then you know I loathe sermon movies. You need to do that by straight up preaching at me? Ugh, muy malo. Fittingly, Rotten Tomatoes gave The Happening a cumulative score of 4 out of 10. Over at Metacritic, the average grade assigned by movie watchers was a D. The goofy flick, it was even nominated for 4 Golden Raspberry Awards, including Worst Picture. And I guess I'm not alone at despising movie sermons, or more, I'm not alone for resisting those who emphatically preach about climate change. For his part, Mark Wahlberg said that Amy Adams, who was originally the production company's hoped-for lead actress, he said she dodged a bullet by saying no to the part. And I see on a recent TV poll that only 8% of Americans believe that the pressing issue confronting the nation is climate change. Americans are less worried about climate change than Western Europeans, and yet, for all that disinterest, progressive politicians, celebrities, and the major media simply can't stop talking about abrupt climate change. Why? Well, it's a means to tremendous power. But back to the movie. What was Shyamalan's point? Human beings are a cancer to the planet. And that's what the New York Times news feed the other day was suggesting. We are a cancer on the planet. And the Huffington Post, about 11 years ago, printed an article that said the same thing. Quote, what if the Earth, through the guiding hand of Gaia, is wonderfully balanced, self-interacting, a system that regulates the status of life everywhere? End quote. You guys, this kind of thinking is not isolated. It's not sci-fi new age speculation any longer. The major media are making it mainstream. But let me read to you more from that Huffington Post article. Quote, Gaia keeps life in a healthy state, just as the mechanism of homeostasis in the human body works to keep every cell healthy and in balance. But bodies die from cancer, and one wonders if the human race is a cancer that the planet cannot correct for. If all of life constitutes a single superorganism, how much adaptability is left in that organism? Like a malignancy, the basic problem with Homo sapiens is that we want to take over everything. We want to expand without regard for other life forms. Eventually, like cancer, our destruction may be caused by our very success. In its insatiable urge to dominate, a cancer cell drives away all competition, but in doing so it wrecks the body's ecology and therefore is doomed. Gaia, or the total ecosystem if you prefer, has accommodated human life as one species among many, but it is hard to see any planetary mechanism that can check the spread of humans in so many destructive areas. Of course, the fact that we may pollute ourselves out of existence can be accommodated ultimately. And should the human race reach its end game, other life forms will persist, and carry on without us. Has the planet reached its ecosystem limit for including us? If not, how close are we? End quote. And sorry to be so snarky, but I encounter ideas like that and I actually think to myself, okie dokie, you first. You sacrificially do the right thing by the planet first. Lead out. Maybe that means you donate your car to charity or never ride in a car again. Maybe it means you perpetually live in an unheated tent. Maybe it means you never again use a barbecue or never even heed the advice of anyone who ever flies on a jet again. I don't know. But obviously, that is a dramatically different view of the human race than we are given in the Bible. The Bible says earth was created for the human race. In Genesis 1, the crescendo of God's creation, Adam and Eve. The poet-writer depicts God's creation as all building toward the creation of the human race. And then, once they're on the scene, God gives them the earth and the fullness thereof. They are to tend and care and lovingly care for it, and it exists for their benefit. What they do shapes the earth, and it clearly shapes them. So the Bible says the land and the human race mutually inform one another. What happens to one happens to the other. The land is shaped by our presence. And written 4,000 or 2,000 years ago, New Testament, the Bible is aware of this amazing mutual dynamic. Here's an example from Hosea 4, verses 1 through 11. Hear the Lord's word, O people of Israel, for the Lord has an indictment against the inhabitants of the land. There is no faithfulness or loyalty, and no knowledge of God in the land. Swearing, lying, and murder, and stealing, and adultery break out. Bloodshed follows bloodshed. Therefore the land mourns, and all who live in it languish. Together with the wild animals and the birds of the air, even the fish of the sea are perishing. My people are destroyed for lack of knowledge. I reject you from being a priest to me. But the more they increased, the more they sinned against me. They changed their glory into shame. Paul's going to quote that in Romans chapter 1. They change their glory into shame. They feed on the sin of my people. They are greedy for their iniquity. I will punish them for their ways and repay them for their deeds. They shall eat but not be satisfied. They shall play the whore but not multiply, because they have forsaken the Lord to devote themselves to whoredom. Now, is that poetry? Yes, sure. But better question is it true poetry? And of course the answer is yes. The land is polluted when people reject godly knowledge. The land is corrupted when people pursue greed or selfishness or idolatry. The land is grotesquely befouled when there's no justice for lying or murder or stealing or adultery or grift. And we can turn to many other books in the Bible for the same teaching. Psalm 85 puts it this way, quote, Lord, you were favorable to your land. You restored the fortunes of Jacob. You forgave the iniquity of your people. You pardoned all their sin. Surely is salvation at hand for those who fear him, that God's glory may dwell in our land. Clearly, the Bible is uniform that we can pollute the land. And we saw that in spades in my Spiritual World series, Archons wreaking havoc through that Old Testament perspective podcast series. The land and human beings have a God-designed mutual relationship. The land affects people, affects the land, affects people, affects the land, affects people, affects the land. Over in the eastern half of Christendom, the Orthodox take the biblical corpus and argue that man is a microcosm of the whole cosmos. Microcosm, class, please say microcosm. Microcosm, teacher. Microcosm means little world. Man is a little world that symbolizes and represents and images forth, like a regent or an ambassador, the entire cosmos, the entire created realm. And so, man is great. Man is, to the fiery hot consternation of the postmodernists, the Bible shows man is the pinnacle of God's creation. And the Eastern Orthodox clearly don't work any sort of naked or secular anthropology. No, following the Bible's lead, they emphasize that human beings were created in God's image. We are never fully who we were created to be until we enter into relationship and fidelity with our Maker. So, with all that as a background, when we are attuned to God's Ruach or not, what happens to this little cosmos, me, you, man, people, what happens to little cosmos affects the entire cosmos. When the little cosmos is attuned to God's Spirit, there are beneficial ripples that necessarily and unstoppably echo out into the big cosmos. When the little cosmos is opposed to the character of God, the entire cosmos around her is bent, frustrated, misaligned. Now, we could talk about this in sociological ways, but it certainly has its collective, psychological, and theological ramifications, right? Just one theological ramification? Our secular, postmodernist, God-hating, God-rejecting society is not surprisingly in a state of deep and mysterious turmoil because millions of microcosms live in staunch opposition to Christ and his beauty. It is a spirit of Antichrist, after Christ, opposed to Christ. And man, oh man, isn't it true? The mystery of iniquity is great. And it's great because mankind is great. Oh, Holy Lord, heal our land. Heal all the microcosms listening today. Pour your beauty into their souls. Restore them according to the image in which you designed them. But back to the Bible. Nowhere in the Bible is mankind shown as an alien on the planet. The Bible nowhere views our presence on earth as a cancer. We're not an invader to the earth. It was created for us. Today's cynical, hatred-filled, coordinated climate change disdain for the presence of human beings, and holy God, apparently especially the unborn, all of that is directly opposed to a Christian biblical worldview. The powerful today who are working diligently to wipe out massive population numbers, COVID killing off the weak and young men, climate change freezing millions to death in the winter, starving them. The powerful today who are working diligently to wipe out huge population numbers, they are the weapons of demons. The fallen archons hate human existence. They loathe our flourish. They hate that we and not them are the stewards of the planet. And so they do their best to eradicate us by the millions from earthly existence. And one dandy way now to do that? Climate change. And this stuff isn't merely theoretical. Let's look at Sri Lanka. Located just 20 miles off the southeastern coast of India, and I don't know why, but I always think of Sri Lanka as sounding more Asian. Shouldn't it be off the coast of Singapore? Sri Lanka has a population of 22 million. Until just recently, Sri Lanka, which used to be called Ceylon, had the second highest per capita income in South Asia. Second highest. That's doing pretty good. But not now. Now they're in economic freefall. 2 weeks ago, Sri Lanka's prime minister declared the nation is bankrupt. They cannot pay their debts. And that prime minister, he was driven out by protests and riots. They stormed the presidential capital and set fire to his house. He had to flee his own country and go to Singapore. But it's so bad in Sri Lanka, the Associated Press reports that, quote, for months the country has been on edge, triggered by a foreign exchange crisis that has crippled imports of essentials like fuel, food, and medicine. Doctors are warning people to not get sick while families are struggling to eat 3 meals a day in a country that was once an inspiration across South Asia for its expanding middle class and high per capita income. But now, the AP continues, now the government owes $51 billion in debt and is unable to make payments on its loans. Its currency has collapsed by 80%, making imports more expensive and worsening inflation. End quote. And my listener, if you can believe it, the price of fuel, rice, and bread have all tripled in Sri Lanka inside of 6 months. Actually, yeah, I can believe it. The price of gas having gone up 150% here in the States in 18 months. But what happened to Sri Lanka? Look, these things are always profoundly complicated. They always involve many strands: politics, economics, usually some military issue, alliances, and betrayals. I mean, it's only been 12 years since Sri Lanka endured a civil war, a war that China helped them win over the Tamil Tigers, a ruthless bunch. But chief among the problems for Sri Lanka? Climate change. No, not the weather changing. No, not weather patterns changing. No, not like Tulsa, Oklahoma, one hot summer. Climate change. Or still more particularly, the ESGs tightly tethered to climate change? Let me explain. ESGs. With regard to China and the World Economic Forum, I talked about this in my episode number 242, Reading Cars and Evil Societal Patterns, ESG, Environmental Social Governance. Energy scholar Alex Epstein described ESG, quote, as something that measures environmental goodness by how little humans impact Earth, end quote. Right. However, goodness is measured, or however little is measured, and by whom it is measured. Or if I can summarize, ESGs are green energy policies run through a leftist, socialist sieve. Leftist progressive policies that have sweeping effects. Bennies for companies that comply with woke governmental demands, punishments for companies that oppose those social justice demands, price controls, wage controls, tax benefits, tax detriments, goodies for big corporations, and punishments for farmers who oppose the greening of the earth. And all of that which has devastating, my grandma pronounced it that way, devastating economic repercussions. And again, to prove the point, Sri Lanka. Sri Lanka had a wonderfully high ESG score, 98 out of 100. According to the webpage World Economics, Sri Lanka was 8th out of all the planet's countries. And over in Klaus Schwab's part of the world, the WEF, the World Economic Forum, they were praising Sri Lanka. They were doing the goodest among so many nations by not impacting the earth. They had super low carbon emissions. Compared to the average score for a nation of 46, Sri Lanka's 98 rating was stellar. Coupled with Sri Lanka's commitment to stop producing CO2, which means to stop burning fossil fuels, which means the cost of energy will then soar, is that Sri Lanka has a massive governmental welfare program. Universal health care is free. Anybody can go to the hospital for free care. College education is, yep, sweet, free. And how'd they pay for all of that? By borrowing massive amounts from foreign countries. It's all resulted in massive, now apparently unpayable debt. Their commitments to socialism and green energy have helped to crush their economy. They are facing brutal consequences into the future. This morning, when I was reading about all that Sri Lanka in the New York Times, they explained that it was happening. They didn't explain at all how it was happening. It was such a dodge. It was so transparent. But to you, my ear-glued listener, that all sounds great, right? Protecting the planet by reducing gasoline emissions? Free medicine? Free higher education? But the nasty truth is, there is no free lunch. How are the doctors, nurses, technicians, janitors, researchers in the hospital being paid because free doesn't pay the bills? How are professors and administrators and librarians and IT staffers and student life members, how are they being paid? Because the last time I checked, free doesn't pay people's wages. There are real-life consequences to socialistic policies. And now, as we are starting to see with a boots-on-the-ground perspective here in America, with $5 per gallon of gas, inflation at 20% in just a few short months, we see that there are real-life consequences to green energy policies. Our own nation's inflation is not on accident. This is being done to us as a decided policy. Sri Lanka typifies what will happen with a nation committed to ESGs and giving up on fossil fuels. Because we can't solve our problems by treating ourselves as Earth's cancer. We must not solve our challenges by causing famine to sweep through the poorest classes on earth. We can't solve much of anything by adopting progressive policies that do not take reality into account. And again, back to the Bible, we are not a cancer. We were meant to bless the earth and us. Lord have mercy. Christ have mercy. You guys, thank you so much for joining me today. And until next time, please, everyone, go and turn your beautiful God-given brains on.